So last time, Lammy, we agreed to talk about modding and early access and player engagement. So in the modern context of games, players have so many opportunities not just to engage with the people who are developing the games, but to actually modify and change the games themselves to give themselves new experiences. This is normal. It didn't used to be this way. And I wondered, first of all, just from a personal perspective, what you thought and how you feel about as a gamer playing games where you have opportunities not just to modify them, but also to join in the development process when a game is in early access, when it's released before it's really ready to get people to contribute and pitch in and tell the developers what they think. So, what do you think as a player, as a gamer in that context?
I think that overall, I'm happy with the direction that the industry is going. I think that people could have very different opinions about modding compared to early access or betas or alphas um, because they really affect gamers in different ways. But as a whole, I think I would say I'm positive on all of them. I think any opportunity out there for different engagement can be good. It obviously can lead to bad things as well, and we can talk about those for each of those different kinds of engagement. But no, on the whole, I think it's good. I think any opportunity has somebody that will want to engage with it. And I think just because, some people are into modding and others aren't, or some people really like the idea of early access and giving feedback and some people aren't, doesn't mean that we should be worried about the bad aspects. I think we need to let kind of the gamers go to experiences that they want to have, and we'll see where that takes the industry as a whole.
So you say bad aspects. Like, what are the potential bad aspects of this type of engagement, modding, early access, stuff like this?
Well, so they're quite different. I think we need to have a discussion maybe about each of them. I think the first one that comes to mind for negatives is for early access, specifically because I have a friend who is vehemently against purchasing any game in early access on principle. He refuses even games that we've begged him to please play with us because they're really fun, like Valheim that you've played, which is still in early access and is a very fun game. He just, on principle, will not buy them. And I believe that principle is mostly the idea that the industry is taking advantage of gamers by releasing and charging for games that aren't complete. And there is a feeling that charging for a product that isn't actually done, or also there's people like we can also talk about pre-ordering, right? Same idea that there are people who will refuse to pre-order because they think of it as I'm paying for something that doesn't exist yet. And that's not how the market should work. Oh, by the way, he's an economist, if that is at all surprising.
Right, right, right. Well, let's stick with the early access thing because I think this is really interesting. I have just a couple of times purchased an early access game. One of them I've never played, um, in order to support the development of this project. I get that there's a lot of big companies that do this, and maybe that's less cool because it's just a cash grab. It's another chance for them to make sure to sell you something. It's like a politician who's begging you to vote early just to make sure that it's locked in so they don't have to worry about you. They've got your vote and they can focus on people who are maybe a bit softer in terms of their support. It's the same thing from a corporate perspective. Why not just get these people to buy the damn thing so we can focus on getting other people to buy it and focus our efforts? But from an indie developer's standpoint, they need money. They need cash flow to pay their people. And if you think of a Kickstarter, which is absolutely giving money not only to something that isn't finished yet, but to something that hasn't even begun development yet, although many Kickstarters are very polished and there's been a lot of work put into them, those are things that we like to support because we want to show them that there's interest in this, and we want them not only that but to expand the scope of their project because there is so much interest in this. And I think early access could fit into that, but there's a problem that it's not always an indie developer who's doing it, and therefore the money isn't necessarily going anywhere but to the corporate domain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument that somehow it's a cash grab is bizarre to me. I would have to see stats on this, and I'm sure that they're out there, but are early access games making more money, like in total? Because unless they're making a large percentage more money than they would have anyway. Yes, they're getting the money earlier, which is good, right? Just for many reasons, you have it in your hands now. You can do with that money what you will. You can invest it, you can make it go further. And in that way, they might be making slightly more money than they would have in the long term. But to me, releasing a game in early access is actually a huge risk to losing money because you're saying now that people are going to see something that might either change drastically, which could make people happy or not. Like, let's say that you had something you're working on, and through the early access experience of people playing it, you actually change your mind as a developer about the direction of a certain aspect of the game, and you really want to change it. But now you have a subset of players who actually are mad that you changed this thing that had you never released it in early access, they never would have seen it or had any opinion about. Or you release something so early that it's so unpolished people don't ever give it another chance. I mean, another problem with early access games is that everybody who plays it in early access might not come back for the full release, and especially if it's a game that relies on community engagement in the game, you might lose out on a lot of people, and you might not have a big community when your game is actually finished. And I think all of these things are bad, could be bad for players, but could also be bad for the devs. Like, I don't think that there's just this idea that, oh, if you release early access or beta, it's just, or even pre-orders, that it's just instantly a way to make more money than you would have anyway. Locking in those votes early, is that actually guaranteeing more votes? I don't know. I think what you say, it's true that it means that you know how to focus next. It helps the developers focus rather, on the next thing, as opposed to getting maybe a core group in that they otherwise wouldn't have had locked down. I just, do you know if there's actually any studies done on if they make more money if they release early access? Because I feel like it should kind of come out in the wash, and maybe it's a little bit more, but if they do a bad job, it could actually hurt them in the long run.
Yeah, from what I've read, it's a bit too early to say if early access makes companies more money, but any corporate um, financial person would tell you that early money is better than later money, right?
Mhm.
It's like what they constantly say about pay your bills late and receive your checks early,
Yeah.
right? Receive your payments early and pay late. It's a classic adage in the business world because early money can make you money. Early money gives you more flexibility with what to do. So I'm not really sure how the incentives are working there, but I think there is an incentive to drum up support in the early days, but there's also an incentive from a creative standpoint, and this is where I'm really on the fence about this. I have mixed feelings because from the one perspective, I would hate to have something released to the public before it's finished in any creative endeavor. And this is not new. If you think about 19th century novelists, many of them wrote their books in sections that were released serially. Charles Dickens released a lot of his books in serial form. So you'd read a chapter this week, wait until next week, and he could change how he was writing it based on the response that he got to the opening chapters. That may have made his products better, might have made them worse. Both are possible from a creative standpoint. But I think a lot of developers are thinking, let's get people interested in this early. Let's start spreading the word. And if it's not working, we can change course. If these features are not working. And from a player perspective, when I'm in an early, so I'll give you an example of an early access game. Probably the only early access game I've ever played, other than Valheim, is Baldur's Gate 3. And I've had very limited time in this game, but I really enjoyed it, in part because I was primed to enjoy it. I enjoyed playing the first two games in the series and also Larian's game, Divinity Original Sin 2. This is a mix, in a way, of the two of them, although people will gripe that it's just Divinity Original Sin 3 and has nothing to do with Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, except for the fact that it's set in the same world. But what I found so interesting is that this is a company that has a very clear and distinct vision for this game. They know in general terms what the story is. They're using the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition rule set, so they're not going to tinker too much with that, although they all are already tinkering somewhat. They have a really good grasp of what they're going to do, and they've got tons of experience. So they're not going to blow in the wind of audience participation. They're not just going to fold 180 degrees and decide to do something different. They've got principles and they've got a vision. And by us playing it, we're showing them what we like, we're showing them what we don't like, we're showing them what they couldn't have possibly imagined is wrong with it, and avenues that they couldn't have possibly imagined they needed to explore. That's wonderful. And I support that. And I love playing it for that reason. I just think though that there would be some circumstances where it would completely narrow you into doing a project in a game that is no longer as challenging, no longer as different, wouldn't break the mold so much. If we think of a game that really breaks the mold, would that have been something that would be released in early access and been successful? It's what we talked about before when if you think of an album that you hate at first, but eventually come to love, well, you have to get over the hatred at the beginning. That was going to happen. That's a part of the process. If you come across a game that's really challenging you and not what you're used to, that's going to take you to an interesting place if it's a good game. But would you have made that game if it was in early access, or would you have just folded to all of these people saying your game sucks, it's no good, I don't want to play this? Because when it's in early access, people have limited amount of patience. They know there's going to be bugs, they know things are going to go wrong, and they're going to turn it off before they really give it the time that it needs. Baldur's Gate 3, for example, only has 4 levels. In D&D 5th edition there are 20 levels. So 4 levels, you're only really just starting to get a flavor for what your character can do. So are you going to invest that much time in it? Maybe. Some people will, but most people won't. So I think it's a very interesting question. And I do, as you, wonder what the incentives are.
Maybe we should throw in a little bit of chats about demos into this conversation, because early access and demos maybe provide gamers with a similar feel, except obviously the engagement level is very different, because what the developer is saying in early access is that there is a conversation between artist and consumer. And I think that's where both of our pretentiousness maybe gets the better of us, because I kind of agree with you in a way where I feel like there's something almost like a less respectable about not trusting in your own vision as
Yeah.
a creator, that you either need the money or like want that feedback. It's almost like, well, if you believed enough in what you were doing, you wouldn't need the feedback. But I think that I'm just being super pretentious when I think that way, and that it's silly to think that way. But it's hard not to sometimes, because when you do think of these great games that break the mold, none of them were made by people who were unsure of themselves. I feel like there's this idea that everyone who made one of these games that was just mind-blowingly amazing and surprised everyone, the people making them knew that they hit gold, right? There's this, and maybe that isn't true. It'd be interesting to hear about that. But I think that there's this feeling that they made it for themselves often, even if they didn't necessarily think that it would be popular. But they had this like integrity of a vision for their project, and they didn't care, exactly what the rest of the world thought about it, and that's maybe honorable. But the other side of the coin is that I think early access games work very, very well for sort of multiplayer gaming experiences, because I think it's especially those kinds of games where you need to gauge how interactions will happen. Like, I feel like for a single player experience that isn't super expansive or open world or anything, like, why bother doing an early access game? Usually that would mean that they have a story, which means you can't really release an early access game like that because people will start to know the story. It really makes sense to me as something that is competitive or cooperative, has some sort of multiplayer aspect to it. Otherwise, what are they really learning as a developer? And in those kinds of games, I also think of them as having less of a artistic sort of vision in a way, if that makes sense. It's more about people interacting, and you're facilitating humans interacting with each other in some way. And for that, observing how the humans interact in your playground makes a lot of sense, and responding to it.
Yeah, there is a corollary here, again, with politics, democratic politics in particular, right? we want leaders to come to the fore in our society and provide us with a vision that they're confident in, that they've thought about, that they think is good, that they're convinced of, and that they're going to put into action. But that also sounds like a demagogue and a future tyrant at the same time. We want our leaders to be strong and self-assertive and interesting, but also not flip-flop. But when we have a leader who never flip-flops, then that's a leader who's not going to change when they need to change in a system that needs to be at some point elastic, right? It's this interesting demand that we have that people in who are running our country or running our governments or running anything in an elected system are accountable to us, but also have the answers. And there's this divide in these days, if we're going to talk about the politics of it for just a moment, between those who want their democracy to be pure, that you follow the will of the people. You're elected only to execute my will. And you must interpret that will by referendums or by constantly polling the population, which is really not how democracy functions. And it certainly doesn't function well in that circumstance. But there's the other form of representative democracy, which is I've elected you to think for yourself. I've elected you to be flexible. I've elected you to to change when change is necessary. I've elected you to represent my interest as best as you can without constantly bothering me, because direct democracy would be impossible. If we take that corollary to games, what are we asking developers to do? Are we asking them to constantly ask us for feedback and constantly ask us to help them develop the game? That's cool for people like me and you who probably are interested in that. That's great. But most people might not be able to do so, might not be interested, but more importantly, may not be equipped, because we also want developers to go away and come back with something fascinating and challenging, something that is going to blow our minds. And can you really do that when you have a development team of 800,000? Can you really do that when you're constantly asking people what they think of things, when you have that singular vision? But there's another aspect to this too. It's not just early access. Again, we've talked about Paradox games many times. Paradox Development Studios is getting more into the habit of, they constantly release DLCs and free updates to their games where they're expanding. So if you think of the game Stellaris, which we've mentioned before, the original Stellaris is almost unrecognizable to the Stellaris that exists today, which is a vastly more complex game. It has so many more systems that have been added to it. And every time they do an update to expand it, they're starting to ask people, gamers, to play the beta of that update for a period of time so that they can give their feedback and they can kind of work that in. That seems a bit more acceptable to me because the vision has already been established. You know, it's checking back in with us to see if we're kind of staying true to the vision, especially for a game like Stellaris, which I think now is 6 years old. So the original developers of that game are on other projects or not on any project at all. So in a way, to democratize the experience has kept that game perhaps more on an even keel, although I would stand to be corrected by people who maybe are vitriolic against every change that happened since, I don't know, 2.1 or something. Um, but yeah, I think there's an interesting parallel here. And I wonder if there's probably no straight answer, therefore. We probably want both and expect both democratization and leadership at the same time, which is impossible to deliver, but we're craving the best of both worlds, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree with the parallels to politics for sure. I think, I've said it before that obviously the best thing you could imagine is the perfect uh, demagogue that is just super benevolent and therefore, but is also impossibly intelligent and compassionate and whatever. Right? Doesn't ever make any mistakes. That's the best thing you can hope for if they're just a godlike figure that has everything figured out.
Sounds like an AI.
Oh, interesting, interesting.
I've thought, actually, I think that if you were to, and this is a complete tangent, but if you really wanted fair, responsible, and responsive government, the best possible solution to that would be a computer, would it not? Especially if you want to encode a constitution, a set of rules that it must abide by at all times into this computer, and to ask it to, what's your main priority? To treat all people equally, or is your main priority to protect life? Is your main priority national security? All of these must go together, but which one comes first? Well, you and I can do this intuitively, but we're going to make mistakes. And we're not going to be answerable to those mistakes because we won't know why in the moment we did that. And if someone who's close to us is being threatened by something, then we're probably going to privilege that action to take care of that over other ones. Whereas a computer would be completely neutral. But do we want total neutrality? What if a computer decides that the only way for our species to go forward is to eliminate 4 out of every 5 people? Well, no human would, well, maybe a human would do that, but it would be really hard. Computer would have no problem in doing that unless you programmed it to. Anyways, yeah, I find that interesting, and maybe the answer therefore is that AI needs to make games for us. That's I think what I'm saying.
I have a feeling that that's already been tried out. Um, I'm sure somebody will know, but I am sure that they've tried to create, at least to get ideas for games from an AI, because that sounds like something somebody's done.
Back in the 90s when procedurally generated worlds was just coming into vogue, they essentially thought of that as AI created games. That it was lazy game making because you're just getting a computer to do it for you. I'm actually reading Sid Meier's uh, memoir. It's called Sid Meier's Memoir! Exclamation point, and he talks about how um, when he wrote a computer game that no one has ever really played called CPU Bach, which is essentially making up new Bach music that Bach himself had never made, having a computer do it based on certain rules that were from an analysis of Bach's music that many people thought, well, that's cheating. That's not, you can't have a computer do that. But isn't that kind of what Bach himself did? Is just follow rules and generate more music accordingly. Anyways, at the same time, he's talking about modding. And about the same point in the book about how in the 90s modding was just becoming a thing with Civilization 1 and Civilization 2, and people were going into the code and remaking the game. And there was a debate at the time, are you just destroying this beautiful thing that I've crafted, or are you engaging on another level as a player?
Yeah, I almost think we should leave the modding discussion for next time, because I think there's enough to dig into, and I have a lot to say about modding as well. But I'll leave that up to you.
No,
'Cause
let's do that. So then that will be my last question I always ask you, which is, what do you want to talk about next time? That will be it. So I've asked the question. So back to early access. What are you dying to say more about early access then, Lammy?
well, so we talked a little bit about the like we grazed kind of some of the issues, right? I kind of want to come back a little bit to the fear that people have. There's the money grubbing aspect of are the developers essentially releasing poor quality things? Because there's a couple things to unpack for me. I don't particularly care if a company is trying to make money. That's what they're supposed to do. Are they doing it at the expense of something for the consumer? Right? That's the question. And so, like, I don't have an issue with them saying, let's just get money earlier in the development process if I was going to purchase the thing anyway. Like, I don't mind pre ordering because, again, that comes up often. Do people believe in pre ordering? How do you feel about pre orders? Do you see them as similar to early access or
Yeah, I mean, it just from a practical perspective, I don't think I've ever really pre-ordered anything because unless it's cheaper to pre-order, why? Like, why wouldn't I just order when the time comes? Like, unless it's a way to it, make sure I don't forget to buy it, but then if I forget to buy it at the time, then maybe I shouldn't have bought it. You know what I mean? Like, what is the purpose of pre-ordering other than to be philanthropic, right? So yeah, what is it for you?
for me, it's I think it feels like it's closer. The thing is closer. Because it's something I can do to bring the thing closer to me in a more tangible way. I can engage, right? It's marketing, it's hype, but it's enjoyable. Like I enjoy being hyped up for a new game. That process, like I think the month before Animal Crossing New Horizons came out, I was partly insane that month. Like I think my brain was only thinking Animal Crossing for just a full month. I was only watching YouTube about the new game coming out, analyzing every little new released piece of video that I could for it. Um, and the game came out, and like I only played it for a few months or whatever after that, and I think I enjoyed that month of hype more in some ways. Not that the game was a letdown; it was a great game, but that feeling when there's potential, it's it's almost better than the real thing, right? At least for the kind of personality that I have, I really like to work up the excitement for something, and pre-ordering is part of that. I find it enjoyable to pre-order a game. On a practical level, often games will sell out, especially like I do often pre-order Nintendo games because sometimes it's hard to get a copy if you want a physical copy. Obviously, for digital, that's less of an issue. Often pre-orders, if you get them, they will start downloading so that they're ready to play right when they come out. Whereas if you bought it when it came out, you would have to download it. So a lot of things when you have the pre-order is it will literally be ready to play the moment that it comes out, which is another benefit, even if it's digital. So even let's say that you don't have the issue of the other issue, which is having to go buy a physical game and you might not get it until a few days after it's been released. So now you're waiting longer as well. Um, and yeah, often there are bonuses, but I think there's less of a reason for me to, I mean, I guess it depends if there's a monetary aspect of, oh, if you buy it now, it's slightly cheaper, which sometimes does happen. Um,
I think I think what you're saying makes perfect sense because I'm someone who is my own enemy in terms of hype. Like I'm going to anti-hype myself because for some reason I have it caught in my head that hype is bad, that I'm being stupid, that I'm wasting my time. Like even if I'm sitting in an audience and everyone's clapping their heads off, I will not clap. Uh, but but that's more because I rarely feel the impulse to clap. So what? I'm just supposed to stand up now and freak out like the rest of you. I've never hooted or hollered ever. And I used to work in the theater for over 10 years. I've sat in many, many, many audiences, both for films and theater. I've been to sports games. That shows you how much of a sports goer I am. Many sports games I've attended. And I will not hoot and holler. I will not. I'm sure that if I did, I'd have more fun, but I don't want to, right? I'm sure that if I pre-ordered a game, I would have more fun in the anticipation of that game coming out, but I don't want to. I'm too practical. I'm too, um, what's the word? Puritanical, right? I will not order it in advance. It doesn't make any sense. And sometimes I'll see what you're saying, which some games offer special benefits if you pre-order, or you can get the deluxe edition or the special gold collector's 10 years later edition or whatever. The only thing they come with that the original edition doesn't come with is like the soundtrack and a couple of pieces of digital artwork that I will never look at or care about. Now, I'm totally into supporting developers to do what they do. Absolutely. That's not the question. But maybe I'm again my own enemy and I'm having no fun in this, but I'm too practical. Why? Why would I spend money on something I'm not going to enjoy when the thing that is the exact same thing for me is half the price? Why would I pre-order something when I can order it at the time if it's not a physical product? And I'm just getting hyped up on my own anti-hype now, which is probably just a window into my personality because I know that if I were to just give in and have fun with it, well, I'd have fun like you do. So the dividing line between me and you typically is I have no fun, I suck, and you're having just a blast over there just playing all these wonderful games. Yeah.
I mean, and I think people feel that way about early access as well. That's why I made the comparison. I think they feel the same thing. Like, why am I paying early for an experience that is not finished, potentially ruining my own fun? And I think that's where it's the gamer has to make their own mind up about it. They have to do a bit of research. Like if I decide to pay for an early access game, I'm only doing so if it's a game I think I'm going to enjoy. I'm not going to do it just out of the goodness of my heart to help the developer out. Like that is not the relationship that I'm engaging in that case. You mentioned before that you think people who play early access games maybe in some ways have less patience. I actually have more patience, right? Like if somebody tells me, hey, this is a rough draft or this is an early access game, I'm going to be way more resilient to bugs. Like if I played a regular game that had tons of bugs, I'm going to get frustrated and say this game is unfinished and I'll stop playing. If an early access game has lots of bugs, but I'm still enjoying it, I see their vision, I'm still having some fun with it, I'll push through because I'm aware, like they know, uh, it is what it is. So I think the only downside is like I put a lot of thought into whether I'm going to enjoy the game or whether I should wait until there's more content. And the biggest fear that I have is that I will hype too early when the game isn't actually as good as it's going to get. So a great example of this was No Man's Sky, right? That had insane amounts of hype and then was a huge disappointment to people when it finally came out. But I've heard that it's since gotten to be as amazing as all the hype had originally been for it. But now nobody, it's like the boy who cried wolf, and not quite that same parable, but nobody's really giving it a chance anymore. It kind of blew its shot, and there's this grassroots effort to remind people that actually just because you heard it was terrible, it actually isn't anymore. It's been years and years and years with tons of updates, and it's good now. But that's always my biggest fear is kind of burning out on a game when it isn't at its optimal place. But then I also worry about missing out. If everyone else is playing in early access and there's a huge viral game, you have a game like Among Us that everybody was playing that was a tiny kind of game in many ways. But if you miss the wave on everybody else playing it, you're not really getting all the fun of the community out of it that you would have otherwise gotten. Like if you're going to play a dead game, it's not going to be as fun. Again, why I say like all of this conversation is way more to do with multiplayer games, whether they're competitive or cooperative, than it is with single player experiences, because at that point, it's more about your experience with the game anyway. And I think early access in those kinds of games matters a bit less. I don't see why a developer would really do it unless they were really unsure of the direction they were taking the game.
Well, first of all, I think you're totally right about people who play early access games. Like I stand corrected. That makes perfect sense. The kind of person who's going to play an early access game is the kind of person not only because they know there will be more bugs, but they're just the kind of person that bought the game in early access. They're going to be more patient. They're going to take more time with it. They're going to be more forgiving or tolerant of that will go wrong or that are incomplete or whatever, in part because they know that's what to expect. So you're totally right about that. I think when I think about playing an early access game, I'm looking in part to be a part of the process. The reason I bought Baldur's Gate 3 in early access was because I knew I was going to buy this game. I knew I would want to play it at some point when I had the time, and I still haven't really had the time. Um, but I wanted to see it at an early stage just to see what it was like, just to see where things were at, just to see so I could draw the line for myself viscerally between where things were at 2 years before actual release and where things eventually got to. Just because that's fun, but also from a development perspective, I find that really interesting. Like, what changes did they make? Where did they find that things were not good or going wrong or boring or too complicated or not complicated enough? And I think that that's a really interesting question that I ask when I'm playing early access, and it certainly heightens my enjoyment of it. Um, and I'm not the kind of person who gets into the forums and the conversation about it. I know a lot of people play early access so that they can feel they're part of the development process. I think that would be fun, but I guess maybe I'm a bit too cynical of it. Like, they don't really care what I have to say. Like, why would they? Like, I'm a nobody. Why would they care? And I'm sure also if I have an idea about something, 17 other people have the same idea and they've already posted about it vehemently. So for example, with Baldur's Gate 3, I did feel I had a thought about it, which was interesting. There's no day and night cycle in the game. There's also no day and night cycle in Divinity Original Sin 2. But I found that the day and night cycle, the fact that there is a nighttime and a daytime, and you can do different things in different times, and the world feels different. Forget the things that you can do, it just feels different. Like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, nighttime is a very cool, interesting, heroic, roguish time. And it just dispenses with that completely. There's no nighttime at all. And that is not in the spiritual successor category of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. So, of course, I look into the forums and people are talking about this. So, what am I going to just add my voice? Screw that. I don't have time, whatever. And this is just me being stupid and cynical. But I think that that's a big part of how people engage in the early access, is to be part of the process, to be in a way one of the team of 800,000 developing a game.
Yeah, and I know you asked about whether that is good or bad for the developers. And I think that really just boils down to, did they handle it well or not? I think you could totally see it as, if they buckle to every little thing that the community wants as a whole, um, that they might make a worse product. But I don't think that you can answer that just objectively for all things. I think in general, my opinion is that in general, more brains will come up with a better end product, but you have to be discerning, right? Like you have to make edits to the edits. If you hear an edit, that doesn't mean just take it exactly as it comes. Take that edit, really get to the point of what their problem was, because often people will give solutions, but at least from a developer point of view, what I want to hear is, okay, they said, make this feature do this thing instead. What I'm actually hearing is they had a problem and their problem was this. Now we can think about how best to solve that problem. It doesn't need to be their solution. And I think the part that makes for better end products is getting an idea kind of poked at from a million different ways, and ways that you wouldn't have thought of, to inspire creativity. We talked very early on about how sometimes, and in fact often for both of us, having some guide rails and being forced and limited actually inspires more creativity. And I think when you're forced sometimes, and you're really pushed, and you don't get full creative control, and you don't just get to do exactly what you wanted to do, and you're challenged on some of your assumptions of what's fun or cool or interesting, you hate it, right? There's that initial, like, oh, it's uncomfortable to have everyone criticizing this thing that I love that I made. But I think those are just pains from growth, because as long as you take that and turn it into something positive, and take a look at, okay, I know I had this very personal thing and I thought it was a perfect baby because I made it. But if we put that aside for a second and just think, all right, they had some good points there, right? There were reasons why everyone's talking about the day night cycle. What people want is maybe a difference in play styles and behavior, right? Maybe it's not so much day night cycle. That was one way to implement that. But let's get down to the core of what it was that people are now missing that they liked previously, or what it was that doesn't make it feel as dynamic. And maybe the solution is just add the day night cycle back in. But it's interesting. I think that actually helps you grow as a creator, is to take that in and analyze it. But not every developer is going to maybe do that. And not every gamer is going to have either insights or good insights. And it is definitely, in many cases, more work to open yourself up to that.
Well, and here's the question. Does a developer in this case with an early access game or a beta that they're opening up to everybody, do they want insight or do they want data? Right? You say that the more brains you have behind something, the better it's going to become. In some circumstances, yes. I think really the bigger it's going to become, the more complex it could become, but not necessarily the better it could become. In some circumstances, yes. And if we look to the data will tell us where people are having more fun, where they're spending more time, where they're giving up too quickly or too easily, or where they're just getting lost and stuck. The data will tell us these things. And that's really important for a game that is a piece of entertainment, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create an experience for people that is fun. But as we've talked about many times before, games straddle the line between art and entertainment, and some of them are striving to be forms of art. And I wonder if you can do that when you're opening it up so broadly, right? So again, if we take the corollary, or I keep mispronouncing that, if we take the corollary to politics, are we asking people really to participate more on Twitter? Are we asking people to have their voices heard even more than they already are? Surely we're asking for people who don't have their voices heard for them to speak up, but we don't need to hear another tweet from the guy that tweets 80,000 times a day. We don't need to hear it. And is the same true in gaming? Do we really need to hear from the guy that always comments on everything and gives a review on every single thing? If that's the guy that's shaping everything, then you're going to make conventional games and only conventional games because he's in it. He's plugged in. He's a great resource. But maybe sometimes the resource we need is the neophyte who knows nothing, who isn't comment who they need me. They need the guy that isn't commenting on the they need me to just tell them what to do. That's obviously the answer, and that's why we're here. Thank you for solving all the problems, Lammy. Excellent.
All right. So next episode is just going to be you telling us everything you think should be done instead,
Oh
and you don't
God.
need me anymore.
No, but I'm too circumspect. I recognized immediately with the day and night cycle comment about Baldur's Gate 3 that that's a huge undertaking. It wasn't something that was ever in the game. It was in the Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, which are totally different games from another era by a different developer. So if they were to implement a day and night cycle, I imagine that would require an enormous amount of work. Now, Baldur's Gate 3, the development team, I think is like 10 or 20 times the size of Divinity Original Sin 2. So I imagine they have the resources to do it, but do I want that as opposed to a great storyline or better graphics or better mechanics or what? Do I, I understand that the dilemma that a developer faces is deciding with a scarcity of resources where to put their time and energy and where not to put it. What are we going to sacrifice to make our goals more shiny, right? We can't have 30 goals. If you have all the goals in the world, you have no goals at all. We get that. But anyways, I think, yeah, next episode, it will be a litany of all of my decisions and how things should be better and how I'm going to change the world. We'll do both. We'll do games and politics at the same time.
Perfect.
This is really interesting. I'm going to have to think more about early access, and maybe we can do some research and talk about it again. Not necessarily in a full episode, but bring up more learnings, because I think this is shaping, and again, in the larger subject of player engagement, this is shaping how games are made and how games are played today and in the future. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it off for this episode. And I'm looking forward to talking more about modding next week.
See you next time.